Hello, and welcome to another edition of Podcast for the Future. I'm your host, Tim Chrisman, the Executive Director of Foundation for the Future. Today, we're joined by Jason Aspiotis. Jason is a business developer, strategist, finance innovator, and technologist working on the long-term socio-economic development of the space frontier. Jason's currently a business development manager for Axiom Space. He's also the founder and chairman of Finsophy PBC, a financial innovation and technology company that's been developing solutions for transparent, long-term, and space industry-aligned capital for over 7 years. He has a total of 19 years of experience across entrepreneurial, technical, organizational, and project leadership, research development, systems engineering, strategy, and business development. His career really does span the full range of activities that you can do in the space sector, and we'll be able to hear about that. His career includes over 8 years in startup, 17 years in the aerospace and defense industry, and 6 in finance and banking. So we'll make sure we touch on all those. Let's get to it. All righty, great to have you here today, Jason. It's been an exciting year for you, and excited to hear more about that and what's been going on.
Yeah, pleasure to be here, Tim.
Yeah, so before we get into what you're doing over there at Axiom Space, I wanted to take a second to hear more about what was it that got you here? What was the Jason special for the path to where you're at now there at Axiom Space? Because you started off with your education in physics and did a lot of engineering work, and now you're doing business development and have an eye towards finance. So what was that journey?
Boy, take a seat back. We got about 30 years to cover. So I must attribute this to my father, actually, because back in the 80s when I was a kid, he put a giant poster of the solar system in my bedroom wall.
Yeah.
And I remember the poster was actually quite, very intricate, very detailed with the sun, the planets, but it lacked one basic detail, which is the distances or relative distances of the planets from each other. But what it did to me as a kid, it gave me a sense of the solar system is out there and it's close. And as a kid, I remember thinking it'd be really nice to visit the entire solar system in my lifetime, if possible. So that sort of fascination, grew as a function of time. I read books. I remember reading, Cosmos by Carl Sagan in my early teens. And I got myself into science fiction. And then I reached a juncture in my life. I was a mid-teenager, and I actually grew a passion for soccer or football back in Europe.
Yeah.
And I remember asking my dad, saying, "Hey, Dad, I really want to explore being a potential professional footballer." And he's like, "Well, you could do that, or you could go and get an education as an astrophysicist or physicist and pursue your dream for space." So long story short, I picked the latter and began my career in space as a astrophysics undergrad at Florida Tech, which was a great experience. At the end of the program, I realized that even though I loved astrophysics and learning about the universe and how it all works, I also realized that if I want to apply myself the best way possible to get me to the solar system at some point in my lifetime, I should become a little bit more applied and practical. So transitioned to applied physics and got a master's in applied physics at University of Central Florida. So that was from an academic perspective. And, I was very fortunate to have spent a lot of time with professors doing hands-on research on both engineering for some physics experiments, but also engineering for space instruments. Did a quick internship over at NASA KSC. I've been heavily involved hands-on the academic research and engineering side at a very young age in the emergent space industry. And then back in 2008, I got hired by Raytheon Space and Airborne Systems, where I worked on a bunch of satellite systems for NASA, DoD, some commercial stuff, and started maturing as a veteran engineer, quote unquote. And then at some point transitioned into being more of a technical project manager, doing some BD stuff, proposals, and started getting an interest in that part of the industry. And I really enjoyed that.
And sorry to interrupt,
Yeah,
but
yeah, go ahead.
if I remember right, there was some high energy laser work there.
Yes.
That's always fascinated me, especially by mid 2000s, early teens. You're not talking old deuterium fluoride, hydrogen fluoride lasers that are going to kill you if you're in the room with them. Some of these are pretty exciting. I don't know if you did coil, solid state, anything like that, but yeah, love to.
Yeah, so actually in grad school, I worked on femtosecond terawatt lasers as part of my applied physics and optics and lasers degree.
Yeah.
And then at Raytheon, I did work high-energy laser programs at Raytheon. They were solid state lasers. Can't get into the details, but yeah, it was a very cool experience, and the technology has matured quite some bit since then.
Yes.
And that was the juncture in my life where I bridged from purely technical to also business development, because I was part of the team at Raytheon that helped set up their current pretty large laser business line. So that was a pretty cool experience, both from pushing a really cool technology and helping develop it towards operationalization, but also be sort of the entrepreneur in a big, Fortune 500 company, helping set up a new business and a new product line for them. So that was a really good experience.
Yeah, no, that sounds amazing. And anything with lasers automatically sounds cool. So I imagine BD for something like that has got to be a lot of fun.
It was. If I wasn't passionate for space as I am, I probably would have stayed in laser development work. So
nice.
Shortly thereafter, so around 2013, 2014, as Elon was gaining a lot of traction and popularity for SpaceX, and Jeff Bezos was just barely coming out of the woodworks with what he was doing with Blue Origin, and of course Richard Branson with Virgin Galactic, inspired me to really rethink about our position in time and how that aligns with my childhood visions of space and being able to travel the solar system in my lifetime. And it really reinvigorated me to go dive head first back into the industry. So at that point, I broke off from Raytheon and started a company that was focusing on developing new financing mechanisms, long-term financing mechanisms to support this impending growth of the space economy. And that company was called Finsophy, and we worked on a few cool projects, including developing a community savings account for space professionals and space enthusiasts that may have wanted to appropriate their deposit capital in support of long-term capital formation for debt financing of space projects and space infrastructure. Did that for a few years for Booz Allen on some other cool capabilities in tech, both for space and DoD stuff. And then finally in 2021, about 14 months ago, I landed at Axiom as a BD manager and been here ever since and really enjoying it. And, Axiom's a great company doing some pretty amazing things, but I look forward to the questions about that.
Yeah. And as you look back at each one of these steps, no doubt seem like a natural next one, going from theoretical physics to applied to managing that as an engineer and finally ending up where you're at doing business development. But when you look across the arc of it, it can look like it's a wide variance. And that's one of the nice things that we're seeing more and more in the space sector, that where you start doesn't need to be where you end. You kept coming back to following this passion, this dream, and that was always that North Star, for lack of a better term. At any point, were you looking out and thinking like, this is a weird job trajectory for me to be taking, not where I expected?
You're absolutely right. There was always a North Star, guiding vision for where I wanted to focus myself. And, there were parts of the journey that may not have been perfect at the time in terms of specific responsibilities and specific roles. But you're also right that every single one of them was a good stepping stone towards the next step. And
Yeah.
from the applied side to the engineering management side to BD and then finance, all the previous steps help inform and made me better, I believe, at doing the next step. So
Yeah.
I think quite relevant in the industry, you have, for better or for worse, a plethora of specific categories of people that either focus on the science, the engineering, business, etc. It's hard to find people that have touched upon all areas necessary to support this emerging economy, because unlike other industries, we're very unique. The technology spans so many different areas. The nature of doing business in space and operations in space is just hard.
Yeah.
And then furthermore, the economics and the associated financing to get there are also hard and haven't been done before in a way.
Yeah.
So it takes a very unique breed of people, I believe, to be able to touch upon all those things and orchestrate the entire ecosystem step by step forward. So I think part of my journey has been similar in the journey that the space industry is going through in a way.
Yeah, no, agreed. And I think that the more people like that are coming in, the better the entire industry is becoming. It's not just a bunch of rocket scientists sitting around in lab coats. You have this variation and you have these varied career tracks now. And so I think that's only making the sector stronger. So, yeah.
I was going to throw a laser physics joke into this. You sometimes need nonlinear optics to make fun things happen. So,
right.
I consider myself a nonlinear optic in the space ecosystem. So
there we go. There we go. Just make sure your mirrors are polished.
Yeah, that's right.
And so one thing that contributed to us originally meeting was your work around space finance. And so a lot of what got me going here in the space sector was long-term financing for space, that not really being a thing for the government. And so we connected early on there. And as near as I can tell, you're one of the original people who was advocating for debt financing for space. I don't know if that's accurate, but it's at least directionally accurate. What was that like in the early days?
Yeah, I'll tell you about the inspiration. I touched upon this a little bit, seeing Elon, Jeff Bezos, and Sergey Branson putting their money where their mouth is. It was invigorating to get myself back into the space industry head first, but it was also a bit not troubling, but concerning, because I saw that the government had a very short-term vision for the space industry and associated funding for it, and we couldn't just be dependent on billionaires to do the job. It's great that they're doing it, and no doubt they have made a huge difference for the US and humanity in general. I always applaud all three of them and anybody that's invested in the space economy, because they're all visionaries and patrons of, I think, the advancement of our species towards becoming multi-planetary. But again, I was concerned that we can't just bet on just billionaires funding this future. And part of my inspiration to create community bank and derivative debt financing based mechanisms for funding space infrastructure was because of the fact that I just didn't want to see all our bets being hedged on billionaires.
Yeah.
And then it evolved towards, we need more institutional debt financing as part of the problem, as part of the solution, because equity can finance early stage innovation and development and early stage growth. But when you get to the kinds of infrastructure that we're all envisioning to underpin growth of the space economy, that has to be debt. You look at human history, equity plays a role, but when it comes to infrastructure, debt is always the way or the mechanism to finance the creation and sustainment of said infrastructure. So it shouldn't be any different for space. And yeah.
Nobody's selling equity in a mall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I came to that realization as part of the Finsophy team back in probably 2015, 2016. And ever since then, I've been pushing it as much as I can, my team and I, to make it a reality. And the industry has definitely gained a lot more awareness since then. I remember being at a conference back in 2016 talking about this, and people just looked at me so strange. They're like, you want to do debt financing for essentially space settlement? I was like, yeah, that's the way to do it. And people just gave me very strange looks. Fast forward since then and talking about this, and it's relevant. But I don't know if you remember the report that came out of, I believe, AFRL, DIU, and other parts of Space Force, written by key folks from those organizations. Yeah. I think it was the State of the Space Industrial Report for 2021. Right. And they talked about the importance of humans being part of the loop of an overall national space strategy. Because humans lead to economic growth, leads to more infrastructure, more logistics, and all of that provides a more solid foundation for both U.S. economic growth and national security. Yeah. And I was just dumbfounded that 5 years since people would give me strange looks about debt financing space settlement, now you have the Space Force, A, has been created, and B, talking about the importance of synergies between national security priorities and economic growth as a function of human expansion into the frontier. So a lot has happened in the past 5 years, and I'm really happy about it.
It's true. And I always get a kick out of talking about long-term financing for space, because technically for the space sector, those are advanced financing mechanisms, or innovative or novel. But in every other sector, that's some of the original sources of financing, bonds, loans. That's what we started with for financial markets, not equity sales. Yeah. So it's funny that this sector is having to catch up from 1,000+ years of financial service development. It's just, I'm delighted by the irony.
Yeah, it's happening. And part of it has been the economy has been as such the past 2 years, where private capital that's focused on venture and equity type investments has been pretty abundant. So it's sort of it has been, for better or for worse, a low-hanging fruit the past few years.
Yeah.
So as the private capital markets for equity have been abundant, then of course people are going to resort to those. Then SPACs, of course, happened the past couple of years, and those seem to be converging to drying up per se. Yeah. So I strongly believe the next big step is debt financing, and
agreed.
I think there's probably organizations out there being developed to do that exactly. And actually, you're seeing it in Europe a little bit. So yeah, the European Investment Bank has pledged a bunch of debt capital towards emerging companies in Europe that may be focusing on infrastructure. So it's not like it's not being done. It's just a matter of when is it going to be done in the US at the scale necessary to set our collective vision into reality in the next 10, 15, 20 years.
And as part of our push for the Space Corporation Act, which would help backstop some of these credit markets, talking with even big institutions like BlackRock, they don't have an objection to investing in the space sector. They just need help developing a model of where the risk is.
Yeah.
And typically that's done by making investments, and you figure out what the risk is. And so it's a cycle there, but having a initial credit fund, bank, some semblance of that gives the rest of the industry something to measure off of. And now everybody can start jumping in with gusto.
I can't stress enough how important the emergence, or I should say establishment, of the Space Force has been for all this. And I'm loving what I'm seeing from Space Force in regards to on-orbit refueling, on-orbit servicing.
Yeah.
And the narrative they're helping paint for space debris, and space debris being both a problem but also an opportunity for private companies, commercial space to take on and make money from.
Yeah.
So I think the Space Force is a good good thing, both obviously from a national security perspective, but also from driving or seeding some of the infrastructure that is going to be required to develop further infrastructure in low Earth orbit and beyond.
Yeah.
And some of the things that Space Force is talking about, like on-orbit refueling, will at some point when that starts proliferating, debt financing is going to be the number one way to finance that infrastructure.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, and there's a lot of objections to Space Force and don't militarize space, that sort of thing. But when we look back across human history, new lands, new communities grow up around the military expansion. The British Empire grew, and then settlement came along with it. And so those initial military ports, military settlements were what sparked the commercial gains. And I think we should recognize that and embrace it. Once you embrace reality, you have a lot easier time.
And even in quote unquote recent American history, westward expansion, railroads were not only used by private citizens and commercial side, it was used by the military as well. It was classic dual use infrastructure that enabled the expansion of the US and then economic explosion in a good way for the US. So similar to what we're trying to achieve with the space industry.
No, agreed. So yeah, let's turn to your work at Axiom. So you've been there about 14 months, 15 months. The first Axiom mission just splashed down yesterday for us recording this. It was actually supposed to splash down quite a bit earlier, but it just worked out. So what has been going on there? What's it look like on the inside watching that?
I gotta say that we're all super excited, and seeing that happen was definitely a lot of emotions, because it's one thing saying we're building a commercial space station and doing private astronaut missions, one thing actually doing it and see it be so successful and impactful. And let me just say, because I've heard a lot of people talk about private astronaut missions, but what does that mean? And how's it different from tourists? And I actually struggled with that for a couple of months when I joined Axiom, but I did finally get it. And it's a big difference. And I think both are good, right? I'm not saying space tourism, that there's no place for that. But what Axiom is doing with private astronauts, professional astronauts, we're actually setting up the conditions necessary from a socio-economic perspective for humans to not only go to space, but also live and work in space and add value to the global economy from space. The 4 astronauts we sent up, yes, they paid a lot of money to go up there, but they also paid for research and payloads to come up with them. And they spent 12, 13, 14 hours a day working on those payloads and doing research that spanned life sciences, biomedicine, materials. We had a wonderful OSAM, actually a couple of OSAM experiments for enabling capabilities of future on-orbit assembly manufacturing, had advanced edge processing experiments. So it spanned a lot of things that are esoteric to the space economy, but also extend or are extensible to the Earth economy. So I think that's the basis upon which we expand the ecosystem and lead to human advancement. It's not just about going to space for the sake of space or going to space to explore. It's about going to space, learning how to live there, working in space, and then learning how to create those value chains between Earth and space that lead to trade, lead to industrialization, which then leads to further advancement and development from an economic perspective. So that's why it's hugely important. And a lot of people don't see it that way, but I'd like to emphasize that this is why we do what we do. This is why private astronaut missions are really important. And then I'll shut up after I say this, but another important reason is transportation costs, even though they come down a lot in the past 10 years, thanks to SpaceX, they're still pretty high, right? They're still in the range where it's not really affordable by most people and or companies to really do much in space unless you're a big government or defense. the fact that you have people willing to pay to go up there, that creates a feedback of more people want to pay, more spacecraft and rockets being built and operated to do so, creates a positive feedback loop where the price comes down, more people pay for it, the price keeps going down, more people pay for it. So it's an economic lever. And if you look at the early stages of aviation back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, it was only wealthy people affording to fly back then. Most people used ships to cross the Atlantic, even all the way to the 50s and 60s. So it has to start somewhere. And not only are we executing on figuring out how to get people to live, work, and produce economic value in space, but we're also helping create that feedback loop of reducing systemic transportation costs, which will further lead to more economic growth and development for everyone.
Yeah, no, I think those are two great points. And there's often the criticism that we're just wasting money on space. Why don't we help starving children or cure cancer? But I think what you're highlighting there between the science missions and the transportation costs really helps encapsulate the counter to that. And that is we're not shooting pallets of cash into space. We're sending missions up to do dozens, hundreds, if not more, experiments or prototypes of products, services, and tech that directly improve our lives on the ground. That's fantastic. Having the ability to test things in a harsh environment or do things we couldn't do down here in the gravity, that's amazing. That's worth way more than whatever we're paying. But on the transportation side, what is really interesting about air travel is a lot of cargo rides along with the passengers. And so in effect, passenger flight subsidizes our ability to mail things around the world. And we saw that with this mission to the ISS. These passengers were going there one way or another, and they said, hey, let's bring along a bunch of stuff so we're useful. That once you get that feedback loop going, now you have the ability to have a ton of experiments, a ton of new things moving to space for, in some cases, virtually free. Whereas now they cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to get up there. And we're not quite at the point when you can set up a lemonade stand in space, but that's coming.
Give it a few decades, but
That's right. That's right. No, and it's got to be so cool to be able to see, like you said, this actually happening. Because for decades now, people have been talking, companies have been planning commercial space stations or private missions, and now it's real. Now it's no kidding. This isn't CGI. This isn't made up. This isn't a plan. It's for real. And so I imagine that's got to be a huge shot of adrenaline to everybody in the company that's developing these space station programs, and you all on the BD side. Now you have hard data to show as you're going out talking with people. What has that changed in what you're doing?
I mean, we've been planning several missions ahead of time as well. So X2,
Yes.
X3, X4 are things we know are going to happen. What changes now is we have operational past experience and successful thereof.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a good badge to be able to wear, especially from a BD perspective.
Yeah.
Our plans for X2, 3, and 4 remain, and we're really excited to get those done as well. And we have a whole slew of more payloads, experiments, demonstrations, and I'll blanket it as economic value generating payloads as part of all these missions. And then eventually leading to Axiom Station, right? So the first module goes up in 2024, attaches to Node 2 of the ISS. And then, as my colleague, Dr. Mike Bain, our chief engineer, very correctly said, the moment that the first module attaches to the ISS is, I paraphrase, a very unique time for humanity's history and our step forward to becoming a multiplanetary species. the first time you have a commercial module being attached to the government infrastructure of the ISS and operate as a purely private commercial piece of infrastructure that's supporting humans living and working in space.
Yeah, I struggle to have an analogy to what that is like in history. You have to go back a really long ways to even start getting close to a useful analogy to how big a deal this is. We've had, power, water, transportation on the ground forever. It's easy. You find the water, you walk, you have the sun, but those things are now, you're plugging into that there on station, and you're doing that as a company.
Yeah.
It is incredible. And
I can't find an analogy either for terrestrial achievements in human history, but this can be one of the big ones. So
yeah, no, it really is. And it does seem like once that gets attached, the pace starts picking up and build out of independent station, and it's going to be incredible to watch that start to take shape.
Yeah, we have 3 modules thereafter to attach to the first module we put up on the ISS, and the last module is what we call a power and thermal module, which enables us to become a free-flying, self-sustainable space station. At that point, we'll break off from the ISS, and the ISS will soon thereafter retire. Having done an amazing job starting all this. The ISS is another historic moment in our history because it was government created, government operated, but it started all this. So credit given where credit's due with what an amazing piece of infrastructure the ISS has been, and the ecosystem it has helped set up, and they're handing off the baton to Axiom and other companies developing commercial space stations. And I'd like to think that by 2030, there's going to be at least 2 or 3 space stations that are now tripling essentially the economic value that the ISS has been enabling, and growing that to even higher levels in the 2030s and beyond. So it's such an exciting time to be around.
Yeah. Oh no, for sure. And if anybody at Hilton or Marriott's listening, no doubt Axiom is more than willing to add a hotel module if you all want to co-brand it. So you didn't have that option with ISS. You do here.
This is not an official Axiom opinion, but as Jason can say, that's a good idea.
It is going to be a hard time watching the ISS get retired, because we've had a permanent off-world presence for over 20 years now, but it is going to be nice that there's not going to be a gap. It is going to be a handoff, however seamless or not, but it's going to continue.
Let me spend a few moments around that, because that's a good segue, both to what's new about Axiom Station, just from an engineering perspective, where I think the industry is going from a sustainability perspective, and also how it ties back to the financing perspective. Whereas for the past 40, 50 years, we've treated space infrastructure as disposable assets or goods.
Yeah.
What we need to start thinking about is, how do we keep stuff in space? How do we enable the stuff we put in space to actually become assets that stay up there and get used as much as possible? Other than some of the old technology residing in the ISS, a lot of the material and a lot of the modules up there are good pieces of infrastructure. And it'd be nice to figure out a way how to salvage most of it, if not all of it, to continue using and leveraging just the basic infrastructure materials for the types of infrastructure and projects. So, Axiom is developing the station to be up there for at least 30 years. The modules are being designed to have their own propulsion avionics, and therefore we can at some point repurpose them or bring them to a different orbit at the end of the lifetime.
Yeah.
And of course, orbital refueling, as we discussed before, enables all of that stuff, where the commodity of how you move things from point A to point B is no longer a problem. It's no longer expensive. And if you have those logistics in place, then you can talk about a very long-term infrastructure that you can move around, repurpose, and keep using this for as long as possible. And why is that important for financing? If you want to go get debt capital to do project financing or infrastructure financing, it'd be nice to know that the infrastructure financing will be around for 20, 30, 40 years, generating, sort of predictable revenues. So I think the emergence of a sustainable ecosystem goes hand in hand with the debt financing that creates that ecosystem and expands it, and goes hand in hand with making sure we keep stuff in space for as long as possible. So to your point, I wish there was a way to keep the ISS up there forever, if possible. So we'll see if we can figure out something how to do that, but that would be nice.
Put it in a parking orbit. We'll make it a national park or a memorial. But yeah, it's when I've looked at some of the renderings and the designs and the plans for these commercial space stations, it really hits home how old station is. If you look inside the ISS, there's no free space. There are cables running everywhere. There is beds hanging from the walls. It's incredible. And you look at a lot of these new plans and it looks like you would think a space station would look like. Modified trailer from Alabama that a hoarder lives in. It starts to look and feel like, no, this is for real. This is a real space station. It's amazing. So that's going to be really cool. Yeah. I know we're coming up on time here. And so is there anything we didn't talk about that you want to circle back around and hit?
I think we're good. Pretty comprehensive. I'll say that Axiom, part of our business enterprise, is to look at the variety of applications in space. And I didn't mention what my role is at Axiom. We have a team focused on obviously the private astronauts, professional astronauts. We have a team focused on research and how to leverage the microgravity environment to manufacture new products and processes, industrial processes in space. But we also have a team that I'm part of that looks at, how do we use space station infrastructure to support or be an enabling piece of infrastructure and platform for other applications, like potentially OSAM, tech demonstrations, tech developments, and other related applications in orbit and beyond.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the research, manufacturing, and the astronauts. It's also about having large-scale infrastructure that is much, much bigger than traditional satellite buses, has a lot more power, a lot more heat rejection capacity. So there's engineering advantages that we could pass on and support other enabling capabilities from orbit.
Yeah. No, it's really cool, the breadth of opportunities that are opening up with this.
Yeah.
So it'll be exciting to watch and see how this progresses, and we'll have to bring you back here to hear more about what the changing is, because I can't imagine it's not going to be moving fast.
It'd be fun to reconnect in 10 years and see how true we were or not.
There we go. We'll create a chart to fact check ourselves and see what the score is. Cool. All right. Thanks for being on here, Jason. It was a great time, and look forward to seeing you out there in the community.
Yeah. Pleasure being here, Tim. Thank you.